The wind howls across the fjord, carrying with it the scent of pine, smoke, and the distant crash of frozen waves. In the deep north of medieval Scandinavia, winter arrives not with a gentle whisper, but with an unforgiving roar. The days shorten until the sun itself seems weary, casting only pale light before sinking into a long and endless night. In this world of ice and silence, survival depends not on wealth or strength alone, but on wisdom, the wisdom to make food last when the land gives nothing. Imagine a small Viking settlement, clinging to the edge of a frozen coastline. Longhouses huddled together like sleeping beasts, their thick timber walls groaning against the cold. Snow piles high along the thatched roofs. Smoke curls into the frozen air from central hearths, where families gather for warmth. Outside, the world lies silent, but inside, one concern dominates every thought. How will we eat until spring? Unlike many of their European neighbors, the Vikings could not rely on vast reserves of salt to preserve meat. Salt, so essential to medieval preservation, was scarce here. It was costly, difficult to obtain, and almost mythical in value. While Roman soldiers had been paid in salt rations, and while great medieval cities built entire economies around the salt trade, the Vikings faced a harsher truth. The Scandinavian lands, for all their beauty, offered little of it. To survive, they would need to invent other ways. Picture a family preparing for the long dark months. The father has returned from autumn hunts with game, deer, elk, perhaps a bear, brought down after days of pursuit. Fishermen have pulled in nets heavy with cod and herring. The animals are butchered, their blood drained, their flesh ready to be stored. But here lies the problem: fresh meat will rot quickly. Without preservation, these precious resources would spoil before the first snows even settle. In a land where famine is only ever one bad winter away, waste is not an option. Every cut of meat, every bone, every scrap must be made to last. So the Vikings turned to the elements. They looked to the winds, to the fire, to the earth itself. They developed methods that might seem strange, or even unthinkable to us today. But to them these methods were the difference between hunger and survival. The mystery of how the Norse kept their food edible for months, sometimes years, without salt, is one of ingenuity born from desperation. Imagine the uncertainty. As the last days of autumn pass, the ground hardens, and snow begins to fall. A mother watches her children sleep beside the hearth, and she wonders, will the food last until the first shoots of green return in spring? Will the meat hanging above the fire remain safe? Will the fish drying on racks outside the longhouse be enough to carry them through storms? Every decision made in these weeks echoes into the months to come. The Norse world was one of contrasts: abundance in summer, scarcity in winter. In warm months, forests were alive with game, rivers teemed with fish, and meadows filled with grazing animals. But in winter, the same world became a prison of ice. The rivers froze, the forests emptied of life, and the sea turned dangerous, its surface locked by drifting ice. Food must be stored, not for weeks, but for half a year or more. For other peoples, salt was the great solution. Salt drew the moisture out of meat, creating an environment where bacteria could not thrive. It was reliable, simple, and effective. Yet here in the Norse world, it was rare and expensive. A sack of salt might cost what a farmer could not afford. Long-distance trade could bring some, but never enough for entire communities. For the Vikings, salt could not be the foundation of preservation. They needed other answers, and so their ingenuity shaped methods both practical and extraordinary. They learned to trust the cold, hanging meat in the open air, where frigid winds acted as nature's freezer. They built smoky hearths where flames licked and smoldered, and meat hung for weeks, slowly absorbing the fire's protective embrace. They dug into the earth, creating hidden pits where fish and flesh could ferment, transforming into powerful, if pungent, reserves. They laid their trust in the snow, in caves, in the breath of winter itself. Each method was an alliance with the natural world, a pact between human survival and the forces of nature. But in this first moment, in this opening scene, picture the uncertainty and fear. The Norse people were not reckless raiders, as often imagined, but careful planners. The winter ahead was always a question mark, always a trial. Their entire society was built around readiness, storing, saving, preparing, and at the heart of it all was the problem of meat, how to take the wild abundance of autumn and carry it into the empty silence of January. When you think of Vikings, perhaps you imagine ships on the ocean, sails bright against the horizon. But before any voyage could happen, before any raid or discovery could be launched, there had to be food. Strong warriors could not row for days on empty stomachs. Farmers could not tend their land if hunger weakened them. Children could not grow if winter took away their strength. Preservation was not only a matter of sustenance, it was the foundation of the Viking Age itself. Tonight, as you listen, imagine yourself stepping into one of those longhouses. The wooden door creaks as you push it open, and a wave of warmth greets you. Smoke fills the air, mingling with the rich scent of drying meat. Children sleep on furs, their breath slow and steady. Adults speak in hushed tones, planning, remembering, hoping. Outside the snow deepens, and the wind sings through the pines. But here in this circle of firelight, the story of survival unfolds. This is not just a story of meat and storage. It is the story of how a people endured in one of the harshest climates on Earth. It is the story of ingenuity, of adaptation, of the human will to live. The Vikings may have lacked salt, but they possessed something greater, the ability to transform necessity into invention, to make nature itself their ally. And so our journey begins. From the drying racks swaying in the northern wind, to the smoky hearths of timber longhouses, to the hidden pits beneath the earth, we will uncover the secrets of Viking preservation. Each method tells us not only how they ate, but how they lived, how they traveled, how they conquered the seas, and carved their place in history. The fire burns low, the long night stretches on, and in the quiet glow of the hearth, the question lingers: how did they keep meat alive through the dead of winter, when the world itself seemed determined to take it away? Salt. In much of the medieval world, it was more than a seasoning, it was power, wealth, survival itself. Empires rose around its trade, wars were fought over its control, and cities prospered by moving it across land and sea. To most Europeans, salt was as essential as firewood or grain, yet for the Norse people of Scandinavia, salt was a distant luxury, rare, costly, and often out of reach. To understand why the Vikings preserved their meat without it, we must first understand why salt was so difficult for them to obtain. Begin by picturing the geography of Scandinavia. Vast fjords cut deep into the land, their waters dark and cold. Mountains rise sharply from the coast, their slopes thick with pine and birch forests. Beyond them lie endless stretches of tundra and rock. The climate is harsh, summers are short and fleeting, while winters dominate with ice and snow. In such a world, salt was never abundant, unlike warmer regions of Europe, where evaporation ponds could turn seawater into crystals. The chill northern air made this nearly impossible. Even in summer, temperatures rarely reached the consistent heat needed for large-scale salt production, where other civilizations could leave seawater to dry in shallow pools, allowing the sun to work its patient magic. The Vikings had no such option. Their sun was too weak, their summers too brief. Any attempt to create salt through evaporation would fail. As the cold winds returned, freezing water before crystals could form, nature herself placed a barrier between Scandinavia and easy salt production. Of course, there were other methods. Salt could be extracted from burning seaweed or by boiling seawater over long hours of fire, and indeed in some pockets of Norway and Denmark, small amounts of salt were produced this way. But the process was slow, costly, and fuel-intensive. Imagine cutting down entire bundles of wood, precious in a land where timber was needed for homes, ships, and fires, simply to boil water into salt. The yield was meager, hardly enough to preserve the meat of a village, let alone supply entire communities. And so most of the salt in the Viking world had to be imported. This meant trade, long journeys, dangerous seas, and costly exchanges. Salt from the great salt works of France, from the mineral-rich lands of Central Europe, from the Baltic coast, it could make its way north, but only at a high price. For wealthy jarls, salt might appear at feasts, sprinkled sparingly, a mark of status as much as taste. But for ordinary farmers, fishers and hunters, salt was out of reach. It was a treasure they could rarely afford, certainly not in the quantities required to preserve meat for an entire winter. Contrast this with other cultures. The Romans centuries earlier had called salt salt, giving rise to the very word salary, for soldiers were sometimes paid in it. Across Europe, salt roads stretched for miles, carrying the mineral from inland deposits to hungry cities. Towns grew rich by taxing its trade. Whole regions from the salt marshes of Venice to the mines of Salzburg thrived on its abundance. Salt was more than food, it was civilization. Yet the Vikings, for all their daring voyages and expansive trade networks, lived at the edges of this salty world. Their lands lacked great salt deposits. Their climate resisted easy production, and their society, though rich in spirit and culture, could not rival the massive infrastructures of southern Europe. For them, salt was always a challenge, never a certainty. This scarcity shaped everything. Where others salted meat in barrels, layering pork and beef between thick crusts of crystals, the Vikings turned to air, smoke and earth. Where others relied on salt to carry them through winter, the Norse turned to ingenuity. Their culture of preservation was not a choice but a necessity, born from the land's refusal to provide salt in abundance. Imagine again the Norse farmer preparing his winter stores. He may have seen salt once, perhaps traded by a passing merchant, gleaming white in a carved wooden bowl, but such a treasure could never last long, and never be enough. Instead, he would hang his fish to dry in the wind, trusting the Arctic air more than the crystals he could not afford. He would smoke venison above the hearth, letting fire serve the role salt played elsewhere. He would bury food in the earth, harnessing time and nature to transform it into something edible. Where salt was absent, invention filled the gap. There is another reason why salt was scarce. The Vikings themselves were not a sedentary people, bound to the luxuries of settled trade. They were travelers, raiders, explorers, and farmers of a harsh land. Their lives were built around movement and adaptation. In such a world, reliance on an expensive foreign mineral was impractical. They needed preservation methods that did not depend on fragile trade networks. They needed methods that worked in the cold forests, on stormy coasts, and in distant colonies. And so their traditions reflected their independence. Consider the emotional contrast. To a Frankish merchant, salt was routine, part of daily life. To a Viking, it was rare, strange, almost exotic. Where others saw it as common, the Norse saw it as costly. This difference created cultures that diverged in their approach to survival. The Frank preserved with salt, the Viking preserved with nature. Even when salt did arrive in the north, it often carried symbolic weight. At great feasts, where warriors gathered after successful raids, salted foods might appear as luxuries, imports from distant lands, trophies of conquest. A salted ham might sit on a wooden table, not only as nourishment but as a statement, proof that the household had wealth and connections. But once the feast was over, daily life returned to its reality. Ordinary families still faced winter with nothing but their own resourcefulness. Salt scarcity also influenced Viking trade outward. Though they lacked salt themselves, they dealt in products that others desired: furs, walrus ivory, dried fish and amber. In exchange they might gain access to small amounts of salt. But here lies the irony. The very preservation methods they created without salt allowed them to trade preserved foods with other lands. Stockfish in particular, hard-dried cod, became one of Norway's greatest exports, feeding not only Vikings but also Christian Europe for centuries. Without salt, the Vikings developed something unique, and it gave them power in trade where salt could not. And so salt's absence was not merely a limitation, it was a catalyst. It forced the Norse to see the world differently, to lean into the gifts their land did offer: wind, cold, smoke and earth. This absence shaped their cuisine, their traditions, their survival strategies. It made them distinct from their neighbors and helped forge the unique culture that we still remember today. As we continue, keep this in mind: the Vikings did not lack ingenuity. They lacked salt, and that single scarcity pushed them to create methods so clever, so enduring, that echoes of them remain with us still. When you taste smoked salmon, when you see dried fish hanging in northern markets, you are tasting the legacy of a people who thrived not because they had salt, but because they found ways to live without it. Salt may have been the foundation of survival elsewhere, but in Scandinavia, its absence wrote an entirely different story, and it is that story of wind, fire, and frozen earth that we now turn to explore. When we think of the Vikings, we often imagine warriors with axes, sails filled by northern winds, and the clash of shields on foreign shores. Yet beneath the image of raiders and explorers lies a quieter, more constant truth: the daily struggle to eat. Food was more than sustenance to the Norse. It was a bond between families, a measure of survival, and a thread connecting human beings to the cycles of nature. To understand why preservation mattered so deeply, we must first understand how Vikings viewed food itself. Step into a Viking longhouse at the close of day. Smoke drifts lazily beneath the high wooden roof, where beams blackened by years of fire tell stories of countless meals cooked below. Along the benches, family members gather, children leaning against mothers, warriors setting aside their spears, elders recounting stories from winters past. The hearth is the heart of the home, not only for warmth but also for nourishment. Meat simmers in a cauldron, mingling with roots and herbs. The scent is rich, earthy, alive. To eat together is to reaffirm the bonds of kinship and community. Food was not taken for granted. In a land where the seasons were extreme, meals carried weight far beyond taste. Every bite reflected planning, labor, and often sacrifice. A deer hunted in the forest meant hours of tracking, skill, and danger. Fish pulled from icy waters represented the strength of calloused hands and the patience of long hours at sea. Even bread, when it appeared, meant months of tending fields, harvesting, grinding grain, and carefully storing it. To the Vikings, food was never just there, it was earned. Meat played a central role in this world. Unlike parts of southern Europe, where cereals dominated the diet, the Norse leaned heavily on animal protein. Sheep and goats grazed on rocky hillsides. Cattle were kept in byres during the long winters, pigs rooted through forests, and hunters brought home wild game. Fish, abundant in rivers and seas, supplied both fresh and preserved nourishment. To eat meat was not merely indulgence, it was necessity in a land where agriculture was limited by climate and terrain. The abundance of summer could never be trusted to last. Winter demanded foresight, and so preservation was as much about psychology as practicality. To preserve food was to quiet fear, to soothe the gnawing uncertainty of the dark season ahead. A store of dried fish or smoked venison was more than food, it was reassurance. Each slab hanging from a rafter, each bundle hidden away in pits, was a promise that tomorrow's hunger could be met. In this sense, preservation was as emotional as it was physical. Feasting too reflected the Viking relationship with food. On special occasions such as Yule in midwinter, or after a successful raid, longhouses were filled with celebration. Fires blazed brighter, horns of ale passed from hand to hand, and tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats. These moments of plenty carried symbolic meaning. They reminded everyone that life was not only survival but also joy, that food could unite and elevate even in a harsh world. Yet such feasts also emphasized the contrast. Tomorrow might bring scarcity again. The Vikings understood both extremes, holding them in balance. Food was also tied to belief. In Norse mythology, feasting appeared often in tales of gods and heroes. Valhalla itself was imagined as an eternal banquet, where fallen warriors dined on the meat of the boar's Sarimnir, cooked anew each night, and drank from endless horns of mead. Such myths reflected a people who knew the fragility of sustenance, dreaming of a paradise where food never ran out, where hunger was banished forever. The myths of plenty contrasted with the reality of hunger, and in that tension lay the deep cultural significance of food. Survival in Scandinavia demanded careful balance. In the warmer months, families worked tirelessly to prepare for the lean times. Crops of barley and rye were planted and harvested, though never in abundance compared to southern lands. Livestock were bred, milk collected, and turned into cheese, butter, or curds that could last. Hunting and fishing filled stores with meat and fish to be preserved. Summer was a time of frantic labor because everyone knew that winter would ask its price.
Cycle.
Every part of an animal mattered. Bones became tools, hides became clothing, fat became fuel for lamps, and meat became sustenance. Nothing was wasted, for waste meant weakness. A family's survival depended on making use of every resource the natural world provided. To preserve meat was not simply about taste or convenience, it was about respecting the gift of life taken from animals and ensuring that it lasted as long as possible. Imagine the emotions bound to this cycle: the relief when the first successful hunt of autumn brought food to the hearth, anxiety when stores seemed too small, or when storms threatened to cut off access to fishing waters, the pride in a well-stocked larder, the comfort of knowing children would not starve, the sorrow when famine struck, when preservation failed, when hunger entered the longhouse uninvited. These emotions shaped the Viking relationship with food as much as hunger itself. Meals were often simple, yet meaningful. A pot of stew, stretching a little meat with turnips, beans and herbs, might simmer all day on the hearth, feeding an entire family. Bread, made from barley or rye, sometimes mixed with ground tree bark in times of scarcity, was shared among all. Butter, cheese, dried fish, and smoked meats provided variety. To modern eyes, such meals might seem humble, but to the Vikings they were lifelines, reminders that community and preparation could withstand even the coldest night. Preservation also enabled exploration. Without the ability to carry food across seas, the Viking age of voyages and raids would have been impossible. But even before the ships sailed, preservation mattered at home. It allowed villages to remain stable through the long winters, freed families from constant hunting, and gave communities the strength to gather for trade, ritual, and expansion. The relationship between food and survival was not just personal, it was civilizational. Consider the mindset this created. Where we might see food as routine, the Vikings saw it as precious. Where we might separate meals from identity, they tied them together. To sit at the hearth and share a preserved piece of fish was to connect with ancestors who had done the same, with children who would learn the same methods, with a community bound together by necessity. Food was memory, tradition, and continuity. This is why the preservation of meat without salt becomes more than a technical question. It becomes a cultural key, opening the door to understanding the Viking world. To know how they dried, smoked, and fermented their meat is to know how they thought about survival, about kinship, about life itself. Their relationship with food was intimate, fragile, and profound. As the fire flickers low in the longhouse, casting shadows on the walls, one can almost hear the unspoken understanding between the gathered family members. They know that every bite has been earned, that every mouthful is a victory against hunger. In their world, food is not a background detail, it is the center of existence, the quiet heartbeat that sustains their lives. And so when we speak of preservation, we are not merely discussing technique, we are speaking of resilience, of human will, of a culture that built its identity on the ability to endure. The Vikings' relationship with food was one of respect, reverence, and necessity, and in this relationship, we see clearly why their methods of preservation were not only practical, but deeply meaningful. The air of Scandinavia carries a quality unlike that of warmer lands. It is sharp, clean, and often dry, especially when the northern winds sweep down from the mountains or rush across the frozen seas. Long before the rise of scientific explanation, the Vikings understood something profound about this air. It could preserve life. In a land where salt was scarce and winters unforgiving, the wind itself became one of their greatest allies. Drying meat in the open Nordic air was not only a method of preservation, it was an art form, a tradition, and a quiet partnership with nature. Picture the beginning of this process in autumn, the season when preservation mattered most. Hunters returned with their game, fishermen hauled nets heavy with cod or herring, and families gathered to prepare the harvest of animals that would feed them through the dark season ahead. Freshly butchered meat, glistening with blood and still warm from the hunt, could not be left to sit. Within days, it would rot, inviting disease and waste. But when exposed to the crisp northern wind, something remarkable happened. The moisture that nourished spoilage was pulled away slowly, steadily, until the flesh hardened into something long-lasting, safe to eat for months. To dry meat, the Vikings used wooden racks built near their homes or along the coastline. These structures, simple yet effective, allowed air to circulate freely. Imagine rows of wooden poles rising from the ground, crossbeams tied with rope, slabs of meat, and whole fish hanging like banners in the cold. The sight was common across villages, strips of venison, lamb or fish swaying gently in the wind, transforming day by day. To modern eyes, it might look vulnerable, food left unguarded, exposed to weather and animals. But to the Norse, this was security. Each piece hanging on the rack was an investment in survival. The process relied on the unique qualities of the northern climate. In regions closer to the equator, warm air can cause meat to spoil quickly, attracting flies and bacteria. But in Scandinavia, the cold, dry air created conditions hostile to decay. The moisture in the meat evaporated, leaving behind a dense, almost leathery texture that resisted rot. This dried meat could be eaten as it was, boiled in stews or softened in water before cooking. The principle was simple: remove the water, and you remove the danger. The sensory experience of these drying yards must have been unforgettable. Walk through a Viking settlement in autumn, and the smell of fresh meat drying in the wind would fill the air, a mixture of iron, earth and salt carried naturally from the sea breeze. Seabirds circled above, drawn by the scent, though villagers guarded their racks carefully. Dogs prowled at the edges, noses twitching, but knew better than to touch what was vital for the survival of their masters. Each day, the meat grew tougher, darker, lighter in weight. The transformation was slow but certain, a daily reminder that nature, when respected, could be bent toward human need. One of the most famous examples of this method was the creation of stockfish, dried cod, that became a lifeline for Norse communities and later a cornerstone of their trade. Though stockfish will be explored more deeply in a later section, its roots were in this same principle, drying in the northern winds. Cod, abundant in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, could be caught in great numbers and hung to dry on massive racks near the coast. Within weeks, the fish would become as hard as wood, capable of lasting for years if stored properly. Portable, durable, and nutritious, stockfish became both survival food and a valuable commodity. Drying was not limited to fish alone. Lamb, goat, venison, and even horse meat could be prepared this way. Strips were cut thin to ensure proper airflow, sometimes seasoned lightly with herbs or smoke for added protection, but often left plain. The simplicity of the process was its genius. Where salt required wealth and trade, drying required only the wind, the cold, and patience. In this way, it was democratic. Any family, no matter how poor, could dry their meat if they had access to animals and time. There was a rhythm to this practice, a seasonal cadence. In late autumn, when the harvest was over and the hunts completed, entire families worked together to prepare the drying racks. Men butchered and cut the meat, women arranged and monitored the racks, and children learned by watching, sometimes helping to chase away animals or birds. The entire community felt the weight of the task, for everyone's survival depended on its success. By the time winter arrived in full, the racks were emptied, their bounty stored away in wooden chests or hung in cool, dark spaces within the longhouse. The dried meat itself was versatile. Warriors carried strips of it on journeys, easy to transport and eat on the move. Farmers and fishermen boiled it into stews, letting the hardened flesh soften and release its flavor into broths thickened with grains or roots. Children gnawed on it like tough bread, their teeth working slowly, their stomachs filled with nourishment that might otherwise have been lost to spoilage. Dried meat was not always glamorous, not the centerpiece of feasts, but it was the quiet backbone of survival. Beyond practicality, drying carried symbolic meaning. It represented trust in the land, reliance on natural forces, and the patience to wait for transformation. Hanging meat on the racks was an act of faith, faith that the wind would blow cold enough, that rain would not spoil the process, that animals would not steal too much, and that time itself would reward the effort. Each strip swaying in the breeze was a silent prayer for survival, answered by the partnership of human labor and nature's breath. Consider the emotional contrast once more. In summer the world was green, filled with life and abundance. In winter it was stark, empty, and unforgiving. Dried meat was the bridge between these two extremes, carrying the generosity of summer into the barrenness of winter. When families sat by the fire in January and shared dried venison softened in stew, they were not simply eating. They were tasting the memory of autumn hunts, the echo of windswept racks, the labor of their own hands. Preservation was memory made edible. There is also something profoundly human in this method. Long before refrigeration or modern science, people learned to read the language of their environment. They felt the dryness of the air, saw how meat changed when left in the wind, and passed that knowledge down through generations. It was survival distilled into tradition. By the time of the Viking Age, drying meat was no longer an experiment but a certainty, woven into the very rhythm of life. In the broader story of the Viking world, drying played a role far beyond the household. It enabled journeys, raids and exploration. A ship setting out across the sea could not carry fresh meat. It would spoil within days. But dried meat and fish, these could last for months, sustaining crews as they rode into the unknown. Without drying, the Viking Age of expansion might never have happened. In this way, the humble racks standing outside village homes were as essential to history as the ships that carried warriors abroad, and so, drying in the cold Nordic winds was more than a preservation technique. It was a partnership between humanity and nature, a ritual repeated year after year, a symbol of patience and foresight. In every strip of dried fish, in every piece of venison toughened by the wind, lay the story of a people who learned to turn their climate from enemy to ally. Close your eyes and imagine standing by one of those racks. The air is cold on your face, the sound of the wind steady in your ears. Strips of meat sway gently, their surfaces already firm, their colors darkening. Children run nearby, laughing, their breath white in the air. Dogs watch from a distance, tails flicking. Overhead the sky is pale, endless. You are witnessing survival in its purest form, simple, natural and eternal. Step inside a Viking longhouse, and the first thing you notice is the smoke. It clings to the air, curling in slow, drifting patterns, filling every corner with its dark perfume. Your eyes adjust to the dim interior, where only small openings in the roof allow slivers of daylight to pierce the haze. The walls are wooden, lined with woven mats and animal hides. The smell is unmistakable, a mingling of burning wood, cooking food, and cured meat. For the Vikings, smoke was not only a byproduct of fire, it was one of their most reliable allies in the battle against time and decay. While drying in the open air relied on the cooperation of nature, smoking was a method that could be controlled within the home. It required no trade routes, no purchase of salt, only wood, patience and fire. And yet, it was more than functional. Smoking meat over the hearth carried a rhythm, a presence, an atmosphere that shaped daily life inside the longhouse. The food hung above the fire, did not simply wait, it transformed day after day, under the gentle embrace of smoke. Imagine strips of pork or venison, tied with twine, dangling from beams high above the central hearth. The fire below burned low and steady, fueled by carefully chosen wood, birch for a mild flavor, oak for something stronger, alder or juniper for a resinous, almost sweet touch. Each wood lent its own personality to the meat, a subtle character absorbed into the flesh as smoke drifted upward. Over weeks the meat would darken, taking on a glossy, almost black sheen, its texture firm yet yielding, its flavor deepened in ways no mere drying could achieve. The beauty of this method lay in its constant presence. The hearth was the heart of the Viking longhouse. Around it, families cooked, warmed themselves, and gathered to tell stories through the long winter nights. Above it, their future meals quietly matured, suspended in the smoke like offerings to unseen gods. This arrangement made preservation not a separate chore, but part of everyday life. To tend the fire was to tend the food. Every flicker of flame, every addition of wood, was both heat for the family and protection for the provisions. The science behind it, though unspoken by the Norse, was profound. Smoke carries compounds, phendols, aldehydes, acids that deter bacteria and mold, slowing the process of decay. It creates a protective coating, sealing the surface of the meat, while infusing it with flavor. In essence, the fire gave more than warmth. It gave safety. A strip of meat hung above the hearth could last not for days, but for months, even through the deepest cold, when fresh hunting was impossible. But beyond survival, there was pleasure. The taste of smoked meat was unmistakable. Rich, savory, carrying the memory of the fire itself, it offered more than nourishment. It offered comfort. A slice of smoked venison, boiled into a stew, did not merely fill the stomach, it carried with it the warmth of nights spent by the hearth, the labor of those who built the fire, the security of a home that endured through the winter. Smoke turned survival into something flavorful, memorable, almost luxurious, compared to the plain toughness of dried meat. Consider the contrast between the two methods. Dried meat was light, portable, and austere. perfect for journeys, for warbands, for survival on the move. Smoked meat, however, was intimate, domestic. It belonged to the longhouse, to family meals, to the steady heartbeat of settled life. The two methods complemented one another, one suited to travel, the other to home. Together they gave the Vikings flexibility, allowing them to thrive both in their villages and across the seas. In many longhouses, the smoky haze became a permanent feature. The smoke darkened the timbers, left scents in the walls, and seeped into every piece of fabric. It stung the eyes, but it also protected. The same smoke that preserved meat also helped preserve the house itself, discouraging insects and slowing the decay of wooden beams. In this way, the hearth smoke was a double blessing, safeguarding both food and shelter. Think of the daily rhythm inside such a house. Dawn broke late in winter, and the fire was stirred back to life from glowing embers. A woman laid new logs across the coals, watching the flames catch. Above, strips of mutton and pork swayed gently, kissed by the first smoke of the day. Children played nearby, their laughter rising with the sparks. A man sharpened his axe in the corner, the rhythmic scrape blending with the crackle of the fire. The meat hung silently through it all, each day growing darker, firmer, safer. Smoke also carried meaning in the spiritual life of the Norse. To many, fire was sacred, a gift from the gods, a link between the human and the divine. Smoke rising upward was seen as a bridge, a connection to the unseen. To preserve food in the smoke was, in a sense, to entrust it to something greater, to believe that life itself was safeguarded by the same forces that governed the world. When families ate smoked meat, they were not just consuming calories, they were consuming something touched by fire, by ritual, by continuity. Yet this method also demanded discipline. A fire left unattended could burn too hot, cooking rather than smoking the meat. A weak fire could fail to protect, leaving food vulnerable to spoilage. The choice of wood mattered, as did the balance between flame and smolder. In this way, smoking was an art passed down through generations. Young members of the household watched their elders tend the fire, learning when to add more logs, when to let it burn low, when to adjust the hanging meat. Skills gained in childhood became traditions that ensured survival. When winter tightened its grip, the rewards of this labor became clear. In the darkest months, when snow lay deep and hunting was scarce, families drew from their stores of smoked provisions. Meat that had once hung above the fire now simmered in stew pots, its smoky essence filling the air, blending with onions, turnips or grains. Each meal was not only nourishment, but a reminder of foresight and patience. Every bite carried the memory of fires tended in autumn, of smoke-filled evenings, of the household's collective effort. Smoked meat also traveled. Warriors carried it on raids, explorers packed it for voyages, traders brought it along as part of their stores. Though more fragile than dried meat, it lasted long enough to sustain journeys across seas and rivers. In distant lands, when a Viking unwrapped a piece of smoked pork, the scent that rose carried with it the memory of home, the hearth, the family, the longhouse. Smoke was a tether, binding the wanderer to his roots, even when far away. Above all, smoking was a marriage of necessity and comfort. It was survival turned into flavor, preservation turned into atmosphere. The hearth was never only a place of heat, it was the center of life, the forge of stories, the guardian of food. Every tendril of smoke rising upward was both protection and poetry, an invisible shield against hunger and time. Close your eyes, and imagine again, you are inside the longhouse. The fire burns low, its glow flickering across wooden walls. The air is thick with smoke, but not unpleasant. Above you, strips of meat sway slightly, their surfaces glistening dark and fragrant. You hear the crackle of wood, the quiet murmur of voices, the distant howl of wind beyond the walls. In this smoke-filled space, you feel safe. The future is hanging above you, preserved by flame and patience. And so smoking over the hearth was more than a method. It was a rhythm of life, a ritual repeated daily, a quiet assurance that tomorrow would be fed. It was the warmth of the fire made edible, the scent of survival lingering in the air, the timeless partnership between humanity and the element that had always defined it. Long before modern science explained bacteria, enzymes, and microbes, the Vikings practiced fermentation with a kind of instinctive wisdom. They did not know the language of microbiology, Yet through trial, observation and tradition, they discovered ways to transform food into something new, longer lasting, more nourishing, and sometimes safer than it had been before. Among their tools of preservation, fermentation stood out not only for its practicality, but for its mystery. Imagine a cool summer morning in a Viking settlement. In the byre, or farm-out building, wooden buckets line the walls. Some hold milk, still warm from the cow or goat, while others contain a thick, tangy substance that looks nothing like fresh milk. This is skyr, a cultured dairy product that remains popular in Iceland to this day. It is not quite yogurt, not quite cheese, but something in between, a food born of fermentation, rich in protein and longevity. For the Norse, it was both nourishment and preservation, a way to extend the life of milk far beyond its natural span. To make skyr, milk was gently warmed, then curdled with a bit of rennet, an enzyme taken from the stomach of a calf or lamb, or with remnants from a previous batch. Once curdled, it was strained, leaving behind a thick, creamy substance with a tart, refreshing taste. What remained was both filling and durable, lasting days, even weeks, when fresh milk would have spoiled in a fraction of the time. The whey, the liquid separated from the curds, was not discarded. Instead, it too was put to use, sometimes consumed as a drink, sometimes added to stews, and sometimes even used as a pickling liquid for preserving meat. This practice, simple in appearance, reveals much about the Viking relationship with the natural world. Fermentation was never accidental, it was carefully maintained, passed down as craft and custom. A portion of yesterday's skyr served as the seed for today's. Knowledge was embedded in practice, in the quiet repetition of daily tasks. A child watching their mother stir a pot of curdling milk learned by smell, taste, and feel when the transformation was right. Science had not yet put names to the invisible forces at work, but tradition carried them forward with precision. Beyond dairy, the Vikings applied fermentation to other foods as well. Fish, so central to their diet, could be preserved by burying it in the ground, layering it with pine bark, or leaving it in barrels to ferment. The results were pungent, often strong-smelling, but surprisingly nutritious and long-lasting. Some methods produced foods akin to the Icelandic harkal, fermented shark, still consumed today as a cultural tradition. These were not delicacies for pleasure, but essential strategies for survival, foods that carried a family through when fresh catches were impossible. Even grains, when available, found new life through fermentation. Barley, one of the hardiest crops of the north, could be soaked, sprouted, and brewed into ale. Beer was not only a drink, but a method of preservation. Grains that might spoil as raw flour or bread could be transformed into a liquid form that kept for weeks or months, providing both calories and safe hydration. In a world where water was not always clean, ale was often safer to drink than a stream or pond. Thus, fermentation touched nearly every corner of the Viking diet, weaving itself into their daily sustenance and their feasts alike. The flavors of fermentation were bold, sometimes challenging to modern palates, but to the Vikings they were familiar comforts. Skyr was tangy, refreshing after hard labor. Fermented fish was powerful, but sustaining during the long winter. Ale was hearty, warming the spirit in both solitude and community. These foods did more than extend life, they created a sense of continuity, a rhythm of transformation that mirrored the cycles of nature. Milk soured, fish aged, grains sprouted, and yet each became something useful, something enduring. What is striking is the subtlety of the process. Unlike the dramatic sight of meat hanging in smoke or drying in the wind, fermentation worked quietly, invisibly. There was no blaze of fire, no spectacle of sun. Instead, it was patience embodied. A pot left in the corner, a barrel sealed in the earth, a vessel tucked away in a cool storage room. All of these seemed passive, yet they contained life in motion. Invisible armies of microbes transformed food from one state to another, turning the fleeting into the lasting. In this, fermentation carried a spiritual echo. To the Norse mind, the world was alive with unseen forces, spirits in rivers, gods in the sky, powers dwelling in stone and wood. It was not a great leap to imagine that food too could be transformed by invisible hands. Skyr, ale and fermented fish were not merely products of chance, but gifts of nature. mysteries harnessed for survival. Eating them was to partake in a quiet kind of magic, a union between human practice and natural transformation. Consider the role of fermentation in the Viking calendar. Summer brought abundance, milk flowed, fish were caught in great numbers, grains were harvested. It was in this season that the groundwork for survival was laid. Buckets of milk became skyer, fish were buried to ferment, barley was brewed into ale. By winter, when fresh food dwindled, these fermented stores became lifelines. The tang of skyer, the sharpness of fish, the warmth of ale, they were the taste of foresight, of preparation, of human resilience against the cold. In social life, fermentation added another dimension. Ale was not only sustenance, it was celebration. Feasts, weddings, and religious rites all drew upon the power of drink, which in turn drew upon the art of fermentation. To brew was to create not only a beverage, but a bond, a shared experience that united community. Similarly, skyer was more than food, it was culture, passed from one household to the next, enduring even into the present as a symbol of Icelandic heritage. Thus fermentation was both humble and profound. It asked little, a container, some patience, a willingness to trust in unseen processes, yet it gave much nutrition, safety, comfort, and community. It turned the fleeting abundance of summer into the steady sustenance of winter. It gave the Norse people not only survival, but a distinctive flavor to their lives. Close your eyes and picture it once more. A clay pot rests in the corner of a longhouse, covered with a wooden lid. Days pass and within, the milk slowly thickens, sharpens, becomes skyer. Outside, barrels of fish are tucked into the earth, their scent strong but their promise greater. Nearby, a vat of barley bubbles gently, turning into ale. Nothing seems to happen, and yet everything is changing. This quiet alchemy, this patient transformation, is what kept the Vikings fed, strong and enduring. Fermentation was their silent ally, invisible but dependable, carrying them through lean months and harsh winters. It was the art of making time itself work in their favor, of turning impermanence into permanence. In the long story of Viking survival, it was as vital as fire, as water, as the hunt. When we think of pickling today, our minds often leap to vinegar and jars sealed tightly with brine. But for the Vikings, vinegar was not part of everyday life. Their landscapes yielded no vineyards for wine, no great orchards for cider making, and distillation was centuries away. Yet they still found a way to create the sour, acidic environment needed to preserve foods. The answer came from a humble byproduct of their dairy practices: whey, the liquid left behind when milk was curdled into cheese or skyra. This sour liquid, thin and tangy, might seem like waste to modern eyes, but to the Vikings it was a treasure. Whey contained lactic acid, a natural preservative that slowed the growth of harmful bacteria and gave food a distinctive sharpness. In a world where nothing could be squandered, whey was never discarded. It was drunk, used in cooking, and most intriguingly, used as the base for pickling. Here preservation met ingenuity, and simple chemistry became a matter of survival. Picture a Viking homestead in late summer. The air is warm, the days long, and the work relentless. Milk is flowing in abundance, and skyra is being made in large batches. From each vessel of curdled milk comes a steady stream of whey, pale and sour, collected in buckets. Outside, hunters return with cuts of meat, too much to eat in one sitting. Fishermen haul in catches from river and sea. To let any of it spoil would be unthinkable, and so meat and fish are submerged in whey-filled barrels, left to rest in the cool shade. Days later, they emerge transformed, sour, sharp, but safe to eat weeks, or even months later. The process was simple, yet remarkably effective. The lactic acid in whey created an acidic bath that discouraged rot and pathogenic bacteria. Unlike salt, which drew moisture out of meat to preserve it, whey enveloped food in a protective tang. Fish placed in whey kept its structure, though it acquired a distinctly sour flavor. Meat became softer, easier to chew, and safe to consume even after long storage. Vegetables too could be placed in whey, particularly hardy roots like turnips or cabbage. These pickled foods were not merely edible, they became staples of survival in seasons when nothing grew fresh. The taste was not subtle, Accounts from later centuries describe whey pickled food as strong, even challenging to eat for outsiders. Yet for the Norse, this tanginess was both familiar and sustaining. After all, they had grown up with the tartness of skyra and the bite of fermented fish. Sourness was the flavor of endurance, of food transformed from fleeting freshness into reliable. When we think of pickling today, our minds often leap to vinegar and jars sealed tightly with brine. But for the Vikings, vinegar was not part of everyday life. Their landscapes yielded no vineyards for wine, no great orchards for cider making, and distillation was centuries away, yet they still found a way to create the sour, acidic environment needed to preserve foods. The answer came from a humble byproduct of their dairy practices: whey, the liquid left behind when milk was curdled into cheese or skyr. This sour liquid, thin and tangy, might seem like waste to modern eyes, but to the Vikings, it was a treasure. Whey contained lactic acid, a natural preservative that slowed the growth of harmful bacteria and gave food a distinctive sharpness. In a world where nothing could be squandered, whey was never discarded. It was drunk, used in cooking, and most intriguingly, used as the base for pickling. Here preservation met ingenuity, and simple chemistry became a matter of survival. Picture a Viking homestead in late summer. The air is warm, the days long, and the work relentless. Milk is flowing in abundance, and skyr is being made in large batches. From each vessel of curdled milk comes a steady stream of whey, pale and sour, collected in buckets. Outside, hunters return with cuts of meat, too much to eat in one sitting. Fishermen haul in catches from river and sea. To let any of it spoil would be unthinkable. And so, meat and fish are submerged in whey-filled barrels, left to rest in the cool shade. Days later, they emerge transformed, sour, sharp, but safe to eat weeks or even months later. The process was simple, yet remarkably effective. The lactic acid in whey created an acidic bath that discouraged rot and pathogenic bacteria. Unlike salt, which drew moisture out of meat to preserve it, whey enveloped food in a protective tang. Fish placed in whey kept its structure, though it acquired a distinctly sour flavor. Meat became softer, easier to chew, and safe to consume even after long storage. Vegetables too could be placed in whey, particularly hardy roots like turnips or cabbage. These pickled foods were not merely edible, they became staples of survival in seasons when nothing grew fresh. The taste was not subtle. Accounts from later centuries describe whey pickled food as strong, even challenging to eat for outsiders. Yet for the Norse, this tanginess was both familiar and sustaining. After all, they had grown up with the tartness of skyr and the bite of fermented fish. Sourness was the flavor of endurance, of food transformed from fleeting freshness into reliable sustenance. It was the flavor of patience and resourcefulness. There was also a sense of thrift to this practice. Every part of the animal, every part of the harvest, and even every byproduct of dairy was put to use. Nothing was wasted. Where a less resourceful culture might discard whey as refuse, the Norse turned it into a weapon against hunger. In this way, whey became more than a liquid, it became a bridge between abundance and scarcity, summer and winter, comfort and survival. Consider the role of whey pickling in a long voyage at sea. A ship setting out with only dried fish or smoked meat risked monotony and deficiency. But add barrels of whey-pickled cuts, and suddenly there was variety. The sourness, while strong, helped break the sameness of diet, and the lactic acid ensured the food did not rot before the voyage ended. For warriors, traders, or explorers, whey-pickled foods became portable lifelines. They were carried across the North Atlantic, sustaining men through storms and long nights under foreign stars. The method also fit neatly into the Viking worldview. To them, the earth was not merely a stage, but a living system of transformations. Night became day, summer became winter, milk became skyr, and fresh food became preserved food. In this cycle, whey was the agent of change, the quiet force that made impermanence last. Pickling in whey was not flashy or grand, but it carried with it the rhythm of Norse life, a daily practice that spoke of adaptation and resilience. There is a quiet image worth holding in the mind: a clay jar filled with whey tucked into the cool earth floor of a longhouse. Inside, a piece of fish rests, its flesh slowly absorbing the sourness of the liquid. The lid is sealed with leather, perhaps weighted with a stone. Days stretch into weeks. Outside, the seasons shift. The fish once perishable, now waits transformed. When finally eaten, it is no longer fresh, but it is safe, nourishing, and a reminder that time itself can be tamed by patience and practice. Even more fascinating is how whey pickling connected one food tradition to another. Whey was born from dairy, yet it preserved meat. It was the link between cow and fish, between pasture and sea. In this way, it reflected the interconnectedness of Viking life, where every resource was stretched, every tool bent to multiple uses, and every season's bounty served the next. For modern palates, whey pickled food might seem harsh, but we can imagine its place in the Norse world. On a dark winter evening, with snow piled against the walls of the longhouse, a family gathers by the hearth. From a jar comes a portion of whey pickled meat, sliced thin, served alongside bread and skyr. The sourness cuts the heaviness of fat, awakening the appetite. Children eat without complaint, for they have known this taste since infancy. It is not luxury, it is life itself. On a larger scale, this practice reveals the adaptability of the Viking people. They did not depend on a single method of preservation, but wove together smoking, drying, fermenting, and pickling into a robust system. Where one method faltered, another sustained them. Whey pickling filled a gap, where salt was scarce and smoke impractical. Sourness carried the day. It was not the most glamorous technique, but it was one of the most dependable. The tang of whey pickled food echoed in Viking identity. Just as their ships cut through bitter seas, just as their lives demanded resilience, so too did their food carry the sharp edge of endurance. To eat sour was to eat survival. To drink whey, to pickle with it, to embrace its bite was to affirm their place in a harsh but generous world. In the end, whey pickling may not inspire legends like the forging of swords or the discovery of new lands. Yet in the quiet story of Viking daily life, it was a cornerstone. Without it, many meals would not have lasted. Without it, many journeys might have failed. And so in the shadows of history, the humble bucket of whey deserves its place among the great innovations of Norse endurance. It was not salt, it was not smoke, it was not sun or ice. It was sourness, patient, preserving sharp, and it was enough to keep hunger at bay, enough to carry the Vikings from one season to the next. When modern people hear the word decay, it often brings to mind rot, foul smells, and food gone bad. Yet, for the Vikings, decay was not always an enemy. In fact, when guided and controlled, it became one of their most powerful tools for survival. Through fermentation, the Norse transformed perishable foods into long-lasting staples, extending the bounty of summer into the depths of winter and turning harsh necessity into a strange form of artistry. To understand the Viking relationship with fermentation, we must first imagine their environment. In northern Europe, the winters were long, cold, and unforgiving. Fresh harvests vanished quickly, and without modern refrigeration, the only way to ensure survival was to preserve food by any means possible. Smoke, drying, and dairy all played their roles, but fermentation was unique. Unlike the others, it did not merely slow decay, it changed the very nature of food, creating new textures, flavors, and nutritional strengths. Fermentation is, at its core, a dance with bacteria and time. By placing food in the right conditions, buried in the ground, submerged in whey, or sealed in airtight vessels, Vikings allowed natural microorganisms to transform what might otherwise spoil into something edible, even desirable. Fish, meat, dairy, and even grains could be altered in this way, producing results that were sometimes pungent, sometimes sour, but almost always nourishing. One of the most striking examples was the preservation of fish through fermentation. Along the coasts, fish such as herring or cod might be buried in pits lined with birch bark, weighted with stones, and left to rest. Weeks later, what emerged was no longer fresh fish, but something stronger, sharper, and far longer lasting. To a modern palate, the taste might be overwhelming, but to the Vikings, it was life itself. Protein carried safely into months, when the sea offered nothing. In Iceland and Greenland, similar practices endured for centuries. Fermented shark, known today as harkal, has its roots in Viking methods. Sharks contain natural toxins when fresh, but by burying them and allowing controlled decay to break down those poisons, Norse settlers transformed danger into sustenance. What began as a problem, the inedibility of fresh shark, became an ingenious solution through fermentation. But it was not only fish that benefited. Meat could be stored in whey, the acidic liquid left behind from cheesemaking. Immersed in this environment, bacteria thrived in a way that preserved rather than destroyed. The whey soured and grew sharp, but within it, cuts of lamb or goat endured far longer than they would have otherwise. In this way, dairy and fermentation worked together, extending the life of precious resources. Even grains, though scarce in the north, found their place in this tradition. When we think of preservation, it is easy to imagine smoke curling above wooden beams, fish drying in the wind, or barrels of ale fermenting in the corner of a hall. Yet for the Vikings, one of the simplest and most effective methods required no fire, no smoke, and no salt. It relied only on the earth beneath their feet. Burial preservation, storing food underground, was a quiet but vital strategy that allowed them to carry food across the long northern winters. To grasp this, let us begin with the land itself. The Viking world was shaped by extremes of climate. In summer the ground thawed, rivers ran clear, and fields gave up their short harvests. But in winter, frost gripped the soil, snow sealed the landscape, and the air turned bitter. In such an environment, the earth was both a challenge and a gift. Beneath its surface lay a steady coolness, shielded from the harsh winds above. By burying food, the Vikings tapped into this natural cold, creating underground storage that kept food safe far longer than it would have lasted above ground. The process was deceptively simple. A pit would be dug, often lined with stone, birch bark, or wooden planks. Inside, food could be layered, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes packed with straw, and sometimes sealed within containers of clay or wood. Once filled, the pit would be covered, often with turf, creating a barrier against animals and weather. What resulted was not unlike a primitive refrigerator: dark, cool, and stable. Different foods required different care. Fish, for example, might be buried after partial drying or fermenting, giving them even greater longevity. Meat could be wrapped in hides, or placed within sealed containers before burial, protecting it from soil moisture. Dairy products, particularly butter and cheese, were sometimes stored underground in wooden tubs. Even root vegetables and hardy crops could be kept this way. Their freshness extended into the deep months of snow. The burial method also intersected with fermentation. Fish or shark left to ferment underground were not only preserved but transformed into entirely new foods. The soil offered insulation that kept the process stable, protecting against sudden changes in temperature. The combination of burial and controlled decay was a hallmark of Viking ingenuity. They used the earth as both protector and collaborator in the battle against spoilage. Imagine a scene in late autumn. The harvest has been gathered, the animals that cannot be fed through winter have been slaughtered, and preparations for the long cold are underway. A family works together to fill their storage pits. Children carry straw for lining, while adults lower bundles of fish or sealed tubs of butter into the earth. Once everything is arranged, the pit is closed, its presence marked only by a patch of freshly turned soil. Above ground, the air grows sharper with each passing day. But beneath the turf, food rests quietly, guarded by the earth until it is needed. For the Vikings, burial pits were not only about extending food life, they were also about security. By keeping provisions underground, they reduced the risk of loss to fire, theft, or marauding animals. A sealed pit was less vulnerable than food hanging openly in the air, or stored in wooden barns that might be raided. In times of uncertainty, the hidden caches of food below ground could mean the difference between hunger and endurance. There was also an element of ritual to this practice. To bury food was to entrust it to the earth, to hide it away with faith that it would be returned in good condition. In a society that understood the cycles of nature intimately, this act carried quiet symbolism. What is buried is not lost, but waiting. Just as seeds buried in spring would yield crops in summer, so too would food buried in autumn yield nourishment in winter. The method was not without risk. If the pit was poorly lined, moisture could seep in, leading to spoilage. If not sealed well enough, animals might dig through. In warm spells, the balance could falter, leading to unexpected decay. Yet generations of trial and error taught the Vikings how to do this well. The depth of the pit, the materials used, the choice of location, all mattered. Over time, these techniques were passed down, refined and adapted to local conditions. In Greenland, where wood was scarce and stone more common, pits were often lined with slabs of rock. In Iceland, turf and volcanic soil played a role, insulating storage against sudden freezes. Along the Scandinavian coasts, birch bark, abundant and resistant to moisture, was a favored lining. Everywhere people used what was available, turning the earth into a silent partner in preservation. What is striking is how burial complemented other methods. A dried fish might last weeks in the open air, but buried in cool soil, it could last months. Butter, already resilient, became nearly imperishable when sealed and hidden underground. Grain, though precious, could be protected from pests by placing sealed sacks in pits. Each method layered upon the other, building a system of preservation that was more than the sum of its parts. In the stillness of winter, when snow piled high against longhouses and storms battered the coast, these buried reserves became lifelines. Picture a family gathering around the hearth. Supplies in the hall grow thin, but outside, under a mound of earth, food lies waiting. With care they dig into the frozen soil, lifting away turf and uncovering what had been hidden months before. The relief is tangible. The food may not be fresh in the way summer's harvest was, but it is nourishing, safe and hard-won. Burial preservation tells us something important about the Viking relationship with the natural world. They did not only battle the elements, they learned to work with them. The cold, the soil, the cycles of freeze and thaw all became tools in their arsenal. They did not control nature in the modern sense, but they guided it, shaped it, and trusted it. The earth itself became a storehouse, a place of both concealment and provision. Even today, echoes of this practice remain. In some northern cultures, foods are still buried to ferment, preserve, or simply keep cool. Archaeologists uncover storage pits that testify to the wisdom of these ancient methods. And in the language of tradition, the idea of hiding something away for the future carries echoes of that Viking habit, to trust the earth with what is precious. For the Vikings, survival was never easy. But by turning the ground beneath them into a refrigerator, a pantry, and a vault, they found one more way to endure. The burial pits remind us that preservation was not only about fire and salt, but also about silence, patience, and faith in the earth itself. In the Viking world, sweetness was rare, unlike today, where sugar is so abundant that it finds its way into nearly every food. The Norse diet contained only a few natural sources of sweetness. Fruit could provide it in summer, and occasionally, dried berries could be kept into winter. But the truest and most enduring sweetness came from honey. Golden, viscous, and seemingly eternal, honey was more than a luxury. It was medicine, offering healing properties. It was sustenance, a source of energy. It was sacred, linked to myth and ritual. And most importantly for our journey, it was a natural preservative, capable of guarding foods from decay when other methods failed. To appreciate honey's role, we must remember its most extraordinary quality. It does not spoil. Archaeologists have found pots of honey thousands of years old, still edible. The Vikings, though they may not have understood the science, certainly knew its effects. Honey could be smeared over meat or fish to slow bacterial growth. It could be used as a coating on fruits or herbs, sealing them from air. It could be mixed into drinks to extend their life. Its high sugar content created an environment hostile to decay, drawing moisture away from harmful microbes and locking food in a sweet protective embrace. But honey was not simply poured over everything. It was precious, gathered at great cost. Bees had to be carefully tended, or wild hives located and raided. In Scandinavia, where winters were long and harsh, bees required care to survive, and honey yields were often modest. This rarity made honey a treasure, valued as much for its preservation powers as for its taste. It was unlikely that a Viking family would coat entire stores of meat in honey. It was far too valuable. Instead, they reserved it for special foods, for medicines, and for transformation into mead, the drink of the gods. Imagine the process. A beekeeper approaches a hive in late summer, smoke in hand to calm the bees. He pries open the wooden structure, carefully lifting the honeycomb, heavy and glistening with golden nectar. Each drop represents weeks of tireless work by thousands of bees. The honey is gathered, strained through cloth, and stored in clay jars or wooden vessels. Every household that possessed honey treated it with reverence, knowing its worth in winter, when sweetness was scarce and illness common. One of honey's most practical uses was in preserving fruit. Berries, such as bilberries, lingonberries, or crowberries, could be mixed with honey, creating sweet preserves that lasted far longer than fresh fruit alone. This practice not only extended the availability of these flavors into winter, but also concentrated their energy, providing quick nourishment during lean times. A spoonful of berries in honey was a luxury that brightened cold evenings and connected the family to the fleeting abundance of summer. Honey also served as a base for medicinal preservation. Herbs could be steeped in it, their properties preserved in the golden liquid. Garlic, juniper, or other healing plants might be stored in honey, turning it into both a cure and a food. In this way, honey was not only about physical survival, but also about well-being, guarding against sickness when winter's confinement and meager diet left bodies vulnerable. Yet the most famous transformation of honey was its fermentation into mead. Mead was more than just an alcoholic drink. It was a cultural symbol, a link to myth, and a practical method of preservation. To make mead, honey was mixed with water and left to ferment, sometimes with herbs, fruits, or spices added. The result was a drink that could be stored far longer than fresh water or raw honey itself. Alcohol, like sugar, inhibits spoilage, and mead provided not only calories and warmth, but also safe hydration when rivers and wells were frozen. The mythology of mead deepened its significance. In Norse tales, mead was not merely a drink of pleasure, it was divine. The mead of poetry, crafted from the blood of a wise being named Kermesi, granted wisdom and eloquence to those who drank it. This myth reflects how deeply the Vikings revered mead, associating it with inspiration, creativity, and divine favor. When a chieftain raised a horn of mead in a hall, he was not only offering refreshment, but also participating in a tradition that connected his people to the gods. Picture a Viking hall in midwinter. The hearth fire glows, casting shadows against carved wooden beams. Warriors and families sit together, cloaks wrapped tight against the draughts that sneak through the walls. A horn of mead is passed from hand to hand. Its sweetness contrasts sharply with the salted or dried foods that dominate the meal. Each sip is both nourishment and celebration, reminding them of summer's bees, of flowers long since withered, and of the unseen threads that bind them to their gods and ancestors. From a preservation standpoint, mead was ingenious. It allowed honey to be stretched further, transformed into a liquid form that could last through seasons. The alcohol preserved itself, and any fruits or herbs included in the brew were likewise extended. Mead was not just a luxury, it was a clever storage solution. Where fresh berries might spoil, those same berries could live on in a cask of mead, their essence preserved in golden drink. There was also a communal element. Brewing mead required vessels, time and skill. It often happened at the level of the household or community, making the process itself part of social life. Sharing mead in a hall was not only about consumption, but about unity. The preserved sweetness of honey became the sweetness of memory, of companionship, of collective survival. While honey and mead were treasures, their availability varied greatly. In Scandinavia, honey was more limited, and it is likely that in some areas, mead was brewed less frequently. In settlements abroad, such as in England, where beekeeping was more widespread, Vikings had greater access to honey, and so mead played a larger role. Archaeological finds of drinking horns and mead-making equipment suggest that wherever honey could be obtained, it was cherished. The preservation value of honey also extended symbolically. To preserve food with honey was to elevate it, to mark it as special. Meat coated in honey was not ordinary fare. It was likely reserved for feasts, for offerings, or for leaders. In this sense, preservation was not only about practicality, but also about hierarchy and meaning. Honeyed foods were rare, memorable, and significant. Science now confirms what the Vikings observed. Honey contains natural hydrogen peroxide, low water activity, and acidity that inhibit bacterial growth. While they could not have explained these mechanisms, their practices demonstrate a keen empirical knowledge. They knew that honeyed foods lasted longer, tasted sweeter, and carried with them a certain magic. Thus honey and mead illustrate the dual nature of Viking preservation. On one hand, they are practical, extending the life of food and drink. On the other, they are symbolic, representing joy, celebration, and the touch of the divine. In a world dominated by struggle against cold and scarcity, honey provided brightness. Mead turned preservation into ritual. When we think of Viking preservation, we often picture smokehouses, drying racks, or underground pits. Yet the golden sweetness of honey adds a softer note to the story. It reminds us that preservation was not only about survival, but also about savoring, about finding sweetness amid hardship. It was about ensuring not just that the body endured, but that the spirit was lifted. In the end, honey and mead reveal the Vikings as both pragmatists and dreamers. They were people who worked with soil, smoke and frost to survive, but who also cherished the taste of summer sealed in a jar, and the warmth of a drink that carried them into stories of gods and poets. To preserve with honey was to preserve more than food, it was to preserve joy itself. To truly understand how the Vikings preserved their meat without salt, we must step back and see the cycle of the year as they did. For the Norse, survival was not a matter of chance, but of rhythm, an unbroken circle of preparation, harvest, preservation, and endurance. Each season brought opportunities, challenges, and duties, and preservation was never a single event, but a year-long conversation with nature. The year began in winter, deep and dark. Food was scarce, and families drew upon the stores so carefully laid down in earlier months. Dried fish hung from rafters, salted or smoked meat was cut sparingly, and barrels of fermented foods were opened as needed. Honey, preserves and mead added sweetness to otherwise plain meals. Every bite in these months carried the weight of foresight. Was enough stored? Would the reserves last until the world thawed again? The winter table was not abundant, but it was steady, sustained by the foresight of seasons past. As spring arrived, the cycle shifted, snow receded, rivers thawed, and the land stirred back to life. For Vikings this meant renewal, not only in spirit, but in resources. Hunting and fishing resumed in earnest. Fresh fish, caught from rivers and seas, supplemented dwindling winter stores, providing protein that no longer needed to be rationed. Early greens, though limited, offered freshness to complement the preserved foods. Preservation at this time was less urgent. Spring was a season of supplementing and conserving. The family ate from what remained, careful not to waste, but secure in knowing new resources were returning. By summer, preservation became once again an urgent activity. This was the season of abundance, when the land gave its riches most freely. Livestock thrived in green pastures, fish teemed in rivers, and wild game roamed forests in their greatest numbers. But abundance also meant urgency, for meat spoiled quickly in the warmth of summer air. To waste food in such times would be unthinkable, and so summer was the busiest season for preservation. Smoking houses filled with the steady haze of wood smoke, drying racks lined with fish shimmered like silver in the sunlight. Women stirred pots of berries with honey, making preserves that captured the fleeting sweetness of summer. Hunters returned with game to be dried, roasted or packed into pits, where the earth's coolness slowed decay. These months were a whirlwind of activity, for every day without preservation risked loss. Families and communities worked together, weaving food storage into the very rhythm of their days. Autumn brought both harvest and urgency. Crops were gathered, livestock culled, and hunting intensified. This was the time to prepare for the long winter ahead, to turn abundance into endurance. Animals that could not be fed through the winter were slaughtered, their meat carefully preserved. Some cuts were smoked, others dried, still others buried in pits or submerged in whey. This was a time of both gratitude and anxiety. Gratitude for the earth's bounty and anxiety about whether enough had been stored. The entire community felt this urgency. Families might gather together for slaughtering and preservation, turning necessity into a kind of ritual. Children learned by watching, seeing the importance of every slice of meat, every spark of fire, every drop of honey. Preservation was not just practical, it was cultural, teaching each generation that survival was earned through effort and foresight. Autumn was also the time when fermented foods reached maturity. Barrels of sour whey, or ale, casks of mead, and jars of pickled vegetables stood ready for the coming cold. In these foods was the essence of earlier seasons, spring's first herbs, summer's berries, autumn's grains, transformed into sustenance for the dark months ahead. Preservation, then, was not only about holding food, but about holding time itself, capturing each season in a form that could outlast the snow. And so, the year came full circle, returning once again to winter. The doors closed, fires burned steadily, and families gathered around meals that were the product of months of labor. Winter was the great test of preservation, when mistakes could not be undone. If the stores were insufficient, hunger threatened. If they were well stocked, life could continue with strength. Preservation was thus both memory and promise, the memory of summer's abundance and the promise of survival until the cycle began anew. This seasonal rhythm also reinforced the communal fabric of Viking life. Preservation was not merely a household task, but a collective one. Fishing trips, hunting parties, shared smokehouses, and communal feasts all reflected the fact that survival was strongest when shared. The rhythms of food tied the community to the land, to one another, and to the eternal cycle of life and death. From a modern perspective, we might see preservation as a technical challenge, methods of drying, smoking, fermenting. But for the Vikings it was more than technique. It was philosophy, a way of life, a recognition that abundance and scarcity were always intertwined. Preservation was their answer to impermanence, their way of ensuring that the fleeting gifts of the world could endure, that life could continue even when the land itself seemed lifeless. In the end, the seasonal cycle of preservation was not just about food, it was about harmony, between people and nature, between present and future, between survival and celebration. It was about trust, both in their own labor and in the earth's rhythms. To preserve was to believe in tomorrow, to trust that what was stored with care would be enough. And so, when we imagine the Vikings preserving their meat without salt, we must not think of isolated techniques alone. We must see the year in motion, the endless cycle of labor and reward, of scarcity and abundance. Each season was a chapter, and preservation was the story that bound them together. It was not only the key to survival, but the quiet, enduring heartbeat of Viking life. To understand the Vikings fully, we must remember that their lives were never divided neatly between the practical and the spiritual. To them, every act, whether lighting a fire, setting sail, or preserving food, carried layers of meaning. The preservation of meat without salt was not only a matter of survival, it was also a ritual, a symbol, and a dialogue with the unseen forces they believed shaped the world. When a Viking family hung strips of fish to dry in the sea wind, it was more than a technical act. They were placing their trust in nature's breath, believing that the winds themselves, governed by unseen deities, would protect the food from spoilage. When they buried meat in cool pits beneath the earth, it was more than storage, it was a gesture of return, a recognition that the earth gave life, and could also keep it safe. Preservation in this sense was both prayer and practice. The Norse gods were not distant figures, but constant presences. Thor's storms, Njord's seas, and Freya's fertility were felt in every aspect of life. Meat preservation was deeply tied to these forces. Fire, for instance, was sacred, both a destroyer and a preserver. To smoke meat was to call upon fire's cleansing and protective power, ensuring that decay would be driven away. In smoke rising from longhouses, one might imagine the breath of the gods themselves sanctifying the food below. Fermentation, too, carried spiritual weight. To transform meat, fish, or dairy, through the slow work of unseen forces, was to mirror the great cycles of life and death. Just as warriors believed that dying in battle led to rebirth in Valhalla, food that seemed destined for decay could be reborn as something nourishing thanks to fermentation. It was a reminder that nothing truly ended, it only changed form. Preservation was thus a reflection of their cosmology, where the boundaries between life and death, abundance and scarcity, were porous and ever-shifting. Seasonal preservation also aligned with ritual festivals. At the harvest, when animals were culled and their meat prepared for storage, offerings were often made to the gods. A portion of the animal might be sacrificed to Odin or to Freya, asking for continued fertility and abundance in the coming year. The act of slaughter, preservation and sacrifice were intertwined, each feeding into the cycle of gratitude and hope. Storing food was not only preparation for winter, it was an expression of faith that the gods would see the people through the dark months. The communal nature of preservation added to its symbolic power. Smoking houses, drying racks, and feasts were not solitary events. They brought families and neighbors together, turning preservation into ritualized gatherings. The sharing of food carried sacred weight in Norse culture. To break bread, or dried fish, or smoked venison, was to affirm bonds of loyalty and kinship. In sagas, betrayal was often symbolized by the withholding of food, while trust was expressed by its sharing. To preserve meat, therefore, was also to preserve the bonds of community. Animals themselves held symbolic roles. To preserve the flesh of a cow or a sheep was not only to save food, but to honor a creature that had sustained life. The Norse did not take such sacrifices lightly. Rituals of thanks often accompanied the slaughter, with blood sprinkled as an offering. Preservation, then, was not simply about efficiency, it was about respect, a recognition of the sacred exchange between human life and animal life. The meat that was stored in pits, dried on racks, or smoked above the fire, carried within it, not just calories, but the spirit of the animal and the memory of its gift. There is also evidence that certain preservation methods were tied to notions of purity and protection. The use of whey, for example, with its sharp acidity, was believed not only to prevent spoilage, but also to drive away evil influences. Just as sourness could keep decay at bay, so too was it thought to ward off darker spirits. In Viking thought, physical and spiritual corruption were closely linked, and to preserve meat was also to guard against invisible threats. Preservation was therefore an act of defense, both against hunger and against malign forces. Mythology also infused these practices. The Norse creation story itself begins with food preservation of a sort, the primordial cow Odumla, whose milk nourished the first beings into existence. To preserve milk, to transform it into cheese or curds, was to echo this first gift of life. Likewise, the myths of gods feasting in Valhalla spoke of eternal abundance, where meat was never exhausted. The magical boar Ceremia was slaughtered and eaten each day, only to be whole again by nightfall. For the Vikings, preservation brought them closer to this ideal, a way of stretching abundance into eternity. Even the tools of preservation carried symbolism. Smokehouses resembled temples in their own way, places where transformation took place, guided by fire and air. Pits dug into the earth could be seen as miniature graves, where meat died only to return months later as food. Honey used to preserve fruits or meats was more than sweetness, it was the gift of bees, creatures often linked to the divine. Mead born from honey was the drink of gods and heroes, a symbol of immortality. Thus, to preserve food with honey was to infuse it with a touch of sacredness. When preservation succeeded, it reinforced faith, not only in human skill, but in cosmic order. To open a pit months after burial and find the meat still good was a reassurance that the world remained in balance, that gods and humans alike had played their roles well. Failure, on the other hand, when food spoiled or stores ran short, was seen not only as misfortune but as disharmony, a sign that something had gone awry in the relationship between people, nature, and the divine. For us today, preservation may seem mundane, a technical matter of refrigeration and packaging, but for the Vikings it was alive with meaning. Each method was part prayer, part science, part myth. To dry meat in the wind was to trust the breath of the gods. To smoke it in the fire was to invite purification, to bury it in the earth was to rest it in the womb of the world, and to share it later around a fire, on a winter night, was to affirm bonds of kinship, loyalty, and faith. Preservation, then, was more than survival, it was philosophy, it was ritual, it was a reminder that the fragile line between life and death could be bridged with foresight, respect, and trust in forces greater than oneself. To preserve meat was to declare, we will endure, we will honor the gifts of the land, the gods, and the creatures. and we will carry today's abundance into tomorrow's uncertainty. Thus, when the Vikings preserved their meat without salt, they were not only preparing meals, they were practicing faith, affirming community, and binding themselves to the eternal cycles of nature and myth. In their eyes, every strip of dried fish, every cut of smoked venison, every buried joint of beef was more than food. It was a promise to family, to gods, to the future, and that promise, echoing across centuries, is perhaps the most enduring preservation of all. When we look back at the Viking Age, with its longships, sagas, and great halls, the distance between their world and ours can feel immense. Yet, when we pause, breathe, and listen closely, the echoes are unmistakable. Their struggles, their resourcefulness, and their reverence for survival speak directly to the challenges we face today. And perhaps nowhere is that connection clearer than in the way they preserve food without salt. For the Vikings, preservation was about survival, but it was also about balance between nature and human need, between abundance and scarcity, between life and death. In our own time, we too live with these balances, though in very different forms. Where they faced the threat of hunger from failed harvests or harsh winters, we face the threat of waste, overproduction, and environmental strain. Where they learned to honor and stretch every resource, we often struggle to remember the value of what we have. By looking to them, we are reminded that food is never just food. It is story, culture, and connection. One of the most striking lessons the Vikings leave us is resilience through adaptation. They did not have salt mines, nor easy trade access to southern luxuries. Instead, they turned to wind, fire, earth, and fermentation. They adapted to their environment with creativity and discipline. In a modern world where convenience has often replaced ingenuity, this lesson feels especially urgent. When we encounter limits, whether environmental, economic, or personal, the Viking example urges us not to despair, but to innovate, to look again at what nature already provides. The wind, the sun, the soil, all are still here, waiting to be recognized. Equally important is the lesson of resourcefulness. The Vikings wasted little, for waste could mean death in a hard winter. Every part of the animal was used, meat dried, bones carved, hides cured. Preservation was not a luxury, it was an ethic. Compare this with our era, where food waste is measured not in scraps, but in mountains, with millions of tons discarded each year. Their world asks us, what would it mean to treat food with reverence again? To value it as gift, not as disposable commodity. In their methods, we can also find inspiration for sustainability. Smoking required wood, but carefully managed drying required nothing more than wind and sun. Fermentation harnessed invisible natural forces without machines, chemicals, or packaging. These were methods low in cost to the earth, refined by observation rather than excess. In an age of climate change, such practices whisper a reminder. Sustainability is not a new idea, it is an old one, lived daily by those who understood that survival depended on harmony with nature. Another lesson lies in patience. Preservation was slow, meat hung for weeks, fish dried in stages, fermentation unfolded over months. There was no rushing the process. In a world that celebrates speed, instant meals, overnight shipping, rapid everything, the Viking way reminds us of the deep value of slowness. To wait, to trust time, to let transformation unfold at its natural pace. These are qualities not only for food, but for life itself. Preservation was meditation disguised as necessity. There is also a communal lesson. Preservation was rarely solitary. Families gathered to prepare the harvest, neighbors shared racks for drying fish, smokehouses became places of work and conversation. Food brought people together, not only at the feast, but in the preparation for it. Today, in a world often marked by isolation, such communal practices hold a quiet wisdom. What if preserving food, or even simply cooking, was once again something we did together, slowly, with shared stories? What if food preparation could be not just efficiency, but ritual, binding people in gratitude and cooperation? The symbolic dimension of Viking preservation also offers us perspective. They did not separate the sacred from the practical. Preserving food was not merely chemistry, it was prayer, myth, and offering. The earth that kept meat cool, the fire that smoked it, the wind that dried it, all were sacred forces worthy of respect. Modern life often divides the physical from the spiritual, the useful from the meaningful, but their way suggests a different vision, that everything useful can also be meaningful, and every act of survival can carry gratitude. Consider how this might change our relationship to food today. When we eat, do we pause to remember the hands that grew it, the earth that nourished it, the unseen processes that brought it to our plates? The Vikings did, in their own way. And in rediscovering this reverence, we might not only reduce waste or embrace sustainability, we might also feel more deeply rooted in the world, less adrift in the speed and noise of modern life. Another lesson comes from their relationship with uncertainty. The Vikings never knew what the next season would bring. They could not predict the weather, the seas, or the harvest. Preservation was their answer, a hedge against uncertainty. Today, though our challenges are different, uncertainty remains. Economic changes, climate shifts, global disruptions, all remind us that security is never permanent. The Viking practice of preservation suggests that preparation, foresight, and humility are timeless strategies. By saving today's abundance for tomorrow, they teach us to look beyond the immediate moment. There is also a lesson of respect for limits. In their world, scarcity was real, and abundance was fleeting. They lived within cycles, learning to store for winter, to feast when possible, but also to restrain when necessary. Our era, by contrast, often imagines itself limitless, always more, always available, always instant. The Vikings remind us that living well is not about endless consumption, but about balance, rhythm, and respect for natural boundaries. Even their failures carry lessons. Sometimes preservation failed, food spoiled, stores ran short, winters grew long. These moments were devastating, but they also taught resilience, adaptability, and humility. In our time, failure is often hidden or denied. Yet the Viking way suggests that acknowledging failure, learning from it, and adapting is not weakness, but strength. What, then, are the enduring lessons we can carry from their world into ours? That resilience grows from creativity, not abundance. That food is never trivial, but always sacred. That patience, community, and respect for limits are not burdens, but gifts. That uncertainty can be met not with fear, but with foresight. And that sustainability is not an innovation of the future, but a memory of the past. As we reflect, it becomes clear that Viking preservation was more than a survival strategy. It was a philosophy of life, rooted in respect, patience, and reverence for forces larger than themselves. In our own fast, fragmented world, this philosophy offers a calming counterpoint. It reminds us that every meal is a story, every act of preparation, a thread in the fabric of community, every preserved bite a bridge between present abundance and future need. When we imagine a Viking family gathered around their winter hearth, sharing smoked venison or dried fish, we are not only seeing history, we are seeing ourselves. We too long for security, for togetherness, for continuity across the uncertainties of time. We too seek meaning in what we eat and how we live. The difference is not in need, but in method. Their world calls us back, not to replicate, but to remember. And so the lesson of Viking preservation is not a relic of the past, it is a call to the present, to live with respect, to create with patience, to prepare with foresight, and to eat with gratitude. In a time where food is often fast, disposable, and distant, this call is more urgent than ever. By looking to their wisdom, we may rediscover not only how to preserve food, but how to preserve meaning, connection, and hope itself.